Hi, in this tutorial I want to talk about HDR images. Now, sometimes we'll come across scenes where we've got really bright highlights and a lot of shadow detail, and this often exceeds the capabilities of our sensors. As you can see here in this image, I've reasonably exposed the brick here, but you can see that we've lost a lot of detail in the shadows, and we've certainly lost all the highlights in this region, but retained a little bit here. The histogram shows this quite nicely. You see we've got some shadow detail, but quite a lot of it is clipped. As you'll see, this whole region here, right, we've lost all the detail in. And similarly, we've lost some of the details right above the building. Now, for a properly exposed image, right, we don't want to lose any of these sort of details. So an option that we have is to blend exposures by taking an image that's been underexposed and an image that's overexposed. So for instance, here we have an image that has been underexposed, and you'll notice that we have no more clipping on the highlights. However, right, we lose a lot of the detail, or much more detail now, in the shadows. Notice a much larger area has been clipped. So then what we can do is take an image that's been overexposed so that we get proper detail in the shadows. Notice here, there's been no shadow detail loss, and yet on the flip side, right, we lose a lot of the highlight details. So the solution for photographers is to blend all of these exposures together into an HDR image to create something that looks like this. Now clearly, this isn't just a mere blending of all the exposures of those first three images. There's been some Photoshop done to it, like curves adjustments, levels adjustments, and I'll show you how we go from those first three up to this final image. So here are the three images that we want to blend. And I'm going to show you how to do this using something called photomatics. And there are a number of tools available, which I'll list at the end. But this is the one I'll do for this tutorial. Okay, so I've put the three images that we want to properly expose together in a folder. And really, if we're in Lightroom, it's just a matter of right-clicking on the files and go Show in Explorer, and it'll bring them up together. I've just conveniently put them into their own little directory here. Okay, so inside Photomatics, right, here's what Photomatics looks like. Now there are a number of options. What concerns us here though is under the HDR menu, go to Generate or press Ctrl-G. Don't worry about all of this stuff here. You can play around with it, but this is essentially the easiest way to go about generating your HDR image. So we hit Generate, and we want to load a bunch of images. So hit Browse, and here are the three that I've selected to combine. So we hit OK, and then it comes up with a dialog box that have a number of options here. So we have Align Source Images. All right, we most likely want to have that checked. The processing time isn't too much extra. And other options here are Attempt to Reduce Ghosting Artifacts. We won't deal with that. Again, you can take the tone curve, color profiles, and that's a little bit more advanced. Here we can, below that with the raw conversion settings, you can play with the white balance, or as well change your color space, your profiles from Adobe RGB, sRGB, or Pro Photo RGB. I'm just going to leave it at Adobe RGB for now. So click, make sure you have the Align Source Images clicked, and hit OK. And it takes about 20 to 30 seconds to process these images. Now is probably a good time to go get a coffee, maybe a donut. Maybe go out and do some more photography if your computer's really slow. Okay, so once all the processing is finished, you'll get something that looks like this. This is a 32-bit HDR image. Now our monitors are low bit depth. They don't have enough bit depth to display the full 32 bits of an HDR image. So we'll get something that looks like this, and you have a little viewer here that will convert it down to, I think, 16-bit or 8-bit. And you'll start to notice that we have a pretty decent image. It's relatively sharp. right? But first thing you'll notice though is by looking a little at our viewer that all the highlights here, rather the shadows, are reasonably well exposed. Similarly with the highlights, right? So from here, there's not much. This doesn't look pretty. This does not look pretty, obviously. So what we want to do is tone map the image. So go back under HDR, and you'll notice that there's what was previously ghosted is now available. So hit Control-T or tone mapping, and you'll get a dialog box that looks like this. Now this is much better, obviously. Now the default settings look something like this. Okay, and here with all these variables we can change to look probably something closer to this. Anyways, now if the first option is a strength. Now if we pull it all the way to 0, you'll notice that the histogram looks a lot like the reasonably well exposed first starter image that we had, right? The one that was properly exposed, not the under or overexposed one. But it's ugly. This is not a pretty picture. We want to increase the local contrast, right? The strength is contrast enhancements. So about to 80. You could go all the way if you want, right? Get to really burst it out. What you want to be wary of is that the farther you go, the more smoothing, the higher strength of HDR or tone mapping that you apply, right? The more unnatural it will look. So let's keep it at this. And we want to add a bit of color, of course. We don't want to go too far because then it really looks overblown. But let's keep it about 66. And again, just play with that. See if you go all the way here, you lose all the color information. You can always do that afterwards too in Photoshop. So let's keep it about there. Now we've got something called light smoothing. If you take that off, right, we get a really ugly looking image. There's no smoothing on the light at all. You typically want to avoid that. So I personally always stay either the very high or the high. Let's keep it at very high for now. And luminosity, again, fairly standard. Just play around with that, see what looks good. I think I'll keep it at about 2 for this image. And now for the white point, if we were to pull it really far, you'll notice that we start getting some clipping here. All right, we've lost a lot of detail, and you can notice the clipping there. I think the default setting was fairly reasonable. What we want to avoid is any of the clipping. See, we don't have it there. So bring the white point slider down until the histogram shows no clipping at all. Now for the black point, right, we can bring that in a little bit more, essentially move the histogram to the left a little bit. And similarly, if we move the gamma slider to the left, we'll bring the whole image that way as well. That looks fairly reasonable. Now, the other options that we have available are, let's say if we like this setting in particular, right, we could save it, right, and import it at another time if we have more images that need similar processing. It can save us a lot of time, especially when we start changing some of these other options, like color, for instance. As we'll see here, it is a little bit orange looking. Now, this temperature is the same as the temperature you'd find in any color balancing application, like Lightroom or Photoshop. And essentially, if we slide it to the right, it'll start to warm up the image. Yeah, not too bad. And if we go left, it'll cool it down, go towards more of the blue. Well, I think that's not too bad. I'm going to just leave it at 0. Now remember, all of these things is just trial and error. You find something that looks good, just as long as you don't have clipping, right? Pretty much anything is fair game. Now what I've noticed though, and even in just doing this tutorial a second time, that when you combine the images, they're not always identical. There's some randomness in the algorithm or in the way that it processes the light, because I get slightly different results. They're fairly similar, but just beware that you're not always going to get perfectly consistent blending. So you might want to try it a couple times. You want to highlight or saturate the highlights. And here, as with all of this stuff, you can zoom in, right, and notice some of the effects right up close if you've zoomed in. That's probably something worth doing, especially if you're going to make a lot of adjustments. Now if we want to desaturate the shadows, right, here's a better part. You'll start to lose some of the information. You can boost it up, and it looks pretty neat. Again, it's just trial and error. Let's keep it at about 4. Now for the micro contrast, Right, here's what it looks like if you boost it all the way to the right and all the way to the left. I think the middle ground is probably fairly decent for this image, although we might want to do it, no, let's keep it at 0. Now the micro smoothing part, we'll notice here if you boost it up too high, we start to lose some of the detail in here. And personally, let's keep it down to 0. I like having some of this more vibrant, more detailed sky. I think it adds a lot to the image. So I'm going to keep this thing right down to 0. And we get as well highlight smoothing. This stuff isn't, I haven't played around with this too much. See, if we boost it higher, we start to lose some information. Same with the shadow smoothing, right? We lose a lot of clipping. You'll have to be pretty careful with how you deal with that. So let's go back to the tone, and if we pull the gamma, now let's keep it at 10. There we are. So now we've got a pretty decent looking image. Now we can go back to the default setting, right? Here's what it looked like on import. Yeah, you know, not too bad. And here's what it looks like with all of our changes. All right, so the next thing to do is save it to, you have an options here to save it between 8-bit and 16-bit. Now, I would suggest saving it as 16-bit. The file's a bit larger, but it gives you a lot more leeway with respect to the modifications we're going to be making later on. If you save it as an 8-bit, you can't regain that information by converting it to a 6-bit image later on. So let's save it as that. All right, so now once that's saved, we have the option, well, there's really nothing else we can do at this point except for saving the image. So go Control S or File Save, and I've already created one here, but we'll save it as, say, Haggy Hall Tutorial 2. And the image is probably about 50 megabytes or so for a 10 megapixel camera. So we can close that, and here's our new image. We want to go to Photoshop, import this into Photoshop, and let's zoom. So it doesn't look too bad, right? You know, you could leave it as this if you wanted to. We'll make maybe some levels adjustment, and you'd be good to go. But let's do a little bit of Photoshop on this, just to really bring out a few elements like the sky, and maybe a little bit more saturation on the greens here, the reds, make it look a little prettier. Okay, so one of the first things I'll do is go Control J. I guess that's Command J on the Macintosh. I'm not sure which ones correspond to which, so I'll just use the PC terminology. You want to duplicate this layer, and one of the first things we could do is auto levels, and let's see what that looks like. It didn't do too much. See, just a little bit of changing in the contrast. So I'll merge those two layers together with the auto levels done and create a new layer now to work from. And let's go to I'll just look at the levels briefly. You'll notice that it looks pretty decent, although this stuff here is probably blown. And if you hold the Alt key down, well, first of all, you'll notice that we've got some clipping here. And if you hold the Alt key, right, it's pretty obvious to see where that clipping is. And if we bring the slider in, right, we're clearly losing a lot of the detail here. So let's bring that all the way back. And likewise with the shadows, if you hold the Alt key down, we've really only lost a little bit of detail here, which isn't too bad. And if we bring it in, right, we can lose quite a bit more. So let's just keep it as it is without making any levels adjustments. Now, I want to change this sky here. So under this, if you'll notice here on the bottom, you'll have this little, because it's sort of a yin-yang thing, black and white circle. You click on it, and let's make a new adjustment layer called Curves. And I want to pull the sky a bit and make this isn't gonna, It's not going to work too well. Let's do it something like this. You'll notice a little preview section here. I think that looks pretty decent. Good. Now, obviously we don't want to have this curves on a global level here. What we want to do is just apply this curves to the sky alone. So to do that, you notice we have a layer mask on this adjustment layer. Now we can fill it in. If you, on the left-hand side, you'll see that we have, if it's not black and white, just hit D, and that'll set it to the default, and then X will change the foreground to the background. We want to essentially paint over this whole layer mask. Now to do that, you go all backspace, and that'll paint over with the foreground color, which is black. Now we want to reveal the layer mask underneath by painting it over with a white brush. Now I'm going to use a soft brush and at about 600. That should be fairly decent for our purposes here. And an opacity of about 84, that should work. So now I'm really going to do is paint over this layer and reveal the curves adjustments that we've made. All right. Starting to look pretty cool. And just to make sure there we are. Make sure we keep the highlights. We'll try not to paint the curves over that. So here's with some curves adjustments, and here's what it looks like without that. So a pretty big change. And you can also press Control-J on this level if you really want to boost it. Right? That's a bit too much though. So we'll bring the opacity of that one down. No, that's not going to work. So let's just delete that layer. Again, it's just a lot of the stuff is just trial and error to see what works and what doesn't. So again, this is without the curves, and here's with some curves. And we can change, another section we can change for curves too is modifying each of the individual channels separately. I think this can often create some pretty cool effects. Right. Yeah, I think that one's neat. And again, we want to essentially make sure that we don't do too much modification to this lower part. So let's paint over this whole layer again. Use our brush, using the white brush tool. Right, paint over this layer. Yeah, let's do it that way. So what I just did there was played around by duplicating the second RGB curve that we made, the one that we modified each individual channel separately, and compared it to this version. I think what I'm going to do is just delete that first one. So here's the image again without any curves adjustment, and here's with some curves. I think that's looking pretty decent. Now the only other thing I'm going to do here is kind of boost up the levels in this region as well. So let's just make kind of a slight, I mean, it'll take a bit more playing around to get it to look really good. But let's just leave it there. And essentially I'm just going to paint this section here, just to lighten them up. Now another option too you might want to do is go to some saturation, and we could change each individual level. So if we want to change the reds here, we might go into the red and really boost that, maybe some yellows, but let's just boost general overall saturation. Let's change it to something like that. Again, we don't need to have that in the sky, so I'll paint over the whole image, and let's just reveal this section here. This is a pretty sloppy job. You spend a bit more time doing it if you were trying to make this into a, an image you'd want to put up online or something you'd want to be proud of. So there's no saturation, a little bit more saturation. I think it's starting to look pretty good. So let's merge all of these layers together. Again, I should say normally you'd save the whole image with all of this stuff together. I'm not going to do that here. Right, so you can come back and keep modifying each individual layer. But if you've merged them all together, you won't be able to modify these ones individually anymore. So you're stuck with the changes. Anyways, here is our modified image. Okay, and here was the original HDR that we started with. So I think a pretty cool improvement. Let's save that as a Photoshop file. All right. So I'm going to go back to the folder where this one's located and import it into Lightroom. And I want to just import it at the current location. So this is the final HDR image. So that's it, I guess, for HDR. Good luck.